All right. Welcome, everyone, for your patience and for bearing with us. You can imagine how busy a congressman's schedule is, so thanks again for everyone's patience. This is Mike Leonard, Vice President of Government Affairs with ASA, and we are here to hear from one of our greatest champions in Congress, Congressman Rob Wittman, on everything going on related to fisheries and the whole national political scene in Congress, and start to set the stage for what we might expect for the rest of the year. Joining here with me is Jesse Simpkins, ASA's chairman of the board, and with St. Croix Rod. And to introduce Congressman Whitman, Jesse, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you, Mike, and welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm pleased to introduce Congressman Rob Wittman, who represented Virginia's first congressional district since 2007. That district stretches from the suburbs of DC along the western shores of the Chesapeake Bay to the Hampton Road area. Now, since joining Congress, Representative Whitman has been a tireless advocate for recreational fishing and natural resource conservation. He has been an original author of numerous bills to support our nation's fisheries, including the Modern Fish Act, the National Fish Habitat Conservation through Partnerships Act, and the North American Wetlands Conservation Act. He has also been a tireless advocate for the Chesapeake Bay, which is a critical nursery for striped bass and other sport fish. In addition to serving the House Natural Resources Committee, he's a former chair of the Congressional Sportsman Caucus and a current co-chair of the Congressional Wildlife Refuge Caucus. Before being elected to Congress, Congressman Whitman served over 25 years as a public health scientist for the Virginia Department of Health, conducting field research in the Chesapeake Bay. From his experience, he is keenly aware of the ecological challenges facing Virginia public lands, waters, and the environment. He is arguably Congress's most active angler. He spends much of his free time on the water. His knowledge of fishing is evidenced by several articles he's written for Sport Fishing magazine, including a wahoo fishing in the Gulf of Mexico and cobia fishing off North Carolina, both which I would love to be able to do. Welcome, Congressman Whitman. And with that, Mike, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Well, thanks, Jesse, and thanks for that introduction. Welcome again, Congressman. So first, how are you doing? And maybe more importantly, tell us about your last fishing trip.
Okay. Well, thanks, Mike. Thanks so much for all the great work that ASA has done. Listen, I have not had a chance. I normally in the wintertime do some offshore wreck fishing. The fishery off Virginia for sea bass and tautog is normally this time pretty good. Virginia did not apply to be able to open the special sea bass season in February, so we didn't have a special sea bass season. So pretty much the only thing out there right now are togs off of the Virginia coast, and the key is trying to get bait. It's incredibly difficult this time of year to get crabs. So we've been limited both by weather, which has been, very limited as far as weather windows, and especially when you go in a small boat and we have to go, 70 or 80 miles offshore. You don't have a lot of luxury about trying to fit in a 4 or 5 hour weather window. So I haven't had a chance. Did get to do some fishing in the fall. Had a great year for red drum. Caught some beautiful red drum this year. My biggest this year was taped out just short of 60 pounds. So nice red drum. So we had some good times there. I'm looking forward to springtime, another great season of fishing here in Virginia. Our big key is make sure we're doing everything necessary on the fishery policy side. As you know, the big thing before us is Magnuson-Stevens reauthorization. We want to make sure we get that right. There are several different versions out there. As you know, in the committee hearing, there are several things in one of the versions of the bill that could create issues, and we want to make sure we're addressing things like bycatch and others in a thoughtful way, especially for our recreational anglers. One of the things that we're dealing with here on the East Coast, which is similar in relation to fisheries policy issues that have come up in the Gulf Coast, and that is, You know, how do we manage certain populations based on current data? And that's the big issue, I think, within National Marine Fisheries Service. Is there are a lot of things that we see anecdotally when we're out there fishing. And I would argue that observational data is incredibly powerful. Although many fisheries managers don't want to see it that way, the hundreds or thousands of hours of observational data that occurs with fishermen out on the water can't be discounted, shouldn't be discounted. Unfortunately, many times it is. And I'll give you a great example. You know, we all know about Gulf red snapper. We all know about the data and how they looked at what was happening with the fisheries. You know, these are structure-related fish. If you do trawl surveys where there is no structure, you know, you're looking for you're essentially looking for elephants in Virginia. You're not going to find them because that's not where they live. What's happening too in many situations, and especially here on the East Coast, is we're seeing a great recovery in shark populations, which is great, biologically a great thing. The challenge is with certain populations like large coastal sharks, those populations have burgeoned to the point where they are creating significant impacts on recreational fishery, whether it's charter fishing, whether it's the weekend charter fishermen. When you're going offshore to try to catch a tuna, you have a hard time competing against the sharks. Anybody that fishes marathon lumps know exactly what I'm talking about. You go down there, you try to fish for blackfins, and when the sharks are there, you just have to leave because you can't beat the sharks. You can't get the fish through the boat fast enough through the sharks. And unfortunately, off the East Coast, if you are now fishing with inside 100 fathoms for yellowfin tuna, it is literally a contest between you and the sharks. And if the sharks have found you, you are not going to win. And I think the sharks have gotten acclimated to the sound of boats, to the sound of engine noise. And when they hear engine noise, it's just like a dinner bell. So the question is how do we then look at managing those populations of sharks, which essentially have shut down the commercial fishery? And the argument is because of the long gestation times for elasmobranchs, for sharks. So I understand that is a biological reality. The problem is the stock assessments for those large coastals hasn't taken place in the way that it should to really reflect the current dynamics. Again, another great example about how data needs to be driving fisheries management, and how in many instances data is just years and years and years behind what we all seeing happening around us. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out what's happening with those shark populations. If you're a tarpon fisherman and you fish out of Boca Grande, sometimes a year, good luck competing against the bull sharks and the hammerheads. And it's amazing to me how a hammerhead can run down a fish like a tarpon and take them out. But those are the things, you know, again, a microcosm, and that's part of the natural system. I'm not advocating to take out all sharks, but I am advocating that, you know, we have to be able to manage those systems in balance. And that goes right back to Magnuson-Stevens. It goes right back to what ASA does and what you advocate for, and that is sound fisheries management based on sound data and with full consideration given to our recreational fishermen. And many times, as you know, some past versions of Magnuson-Stevens Act have been, unfortunately, not ones that have kept in mind our recreational fishermen. So we want to make sure that happens this time. We want to make sure that current sound data is driving these decisions and that we're doing everything we can to get the stock assessments where needed. Now, I think there are 560 plus species that are required to be managed under Magnuson-Stevens. We know all of them are not in a status that need current data. So the question is how do you then direct resources to those populations where we do need current data, where we do know that those populations are either impacting other recreational activities or are seeing maybe current restrictions that are unwarranted just because of the data not being current. So anyway, you know, great example is trying to manage cobia. Jesse talked earlier about I love cobia fishing, but I also love great fisheries management on cobia. And let me close with this. What I think is incredibly powerful too is when fishermen, that is recreational fishermen, take it upon themselves to say, you know what, we're actually going to do some self-advocation. If you drive through the Hampton Roads area, the new thing now are these electronic billboards. You know, they flash up and they change. There is a group of fishermen that have gotten together in the Hampton Roads area who love fishing for speckled trout. And when you drive through that area, you will see a billboard there that says, release all speckled trout over 20 inches. So they've taken it upon themselves, have their own website, and what they want to do is to manage that fishery for trophy speckled trout. Now, we know managing for size versus quantity are two different things in a fisheries management perspective, but it's interesting to see how fishermen, when they band together, can be a very powerful voice. And even if they decide to sidestep the structure of current management, and again, current management can be managing for something different, they want to advocate for a little bit different management structure. And listen, even if they affect the behavior of 25, 30, 40% of those recreational anglers, they will have an impact on the population of speckled trout. So again, another interesting example of that. So Mike, let me do that. Go back to you, and I'd love to answer questions from the people on the call and get their perspective on things.
Yeah, well, thanks for that. And I'll have a few questions first, but before I do that, that comment about the anglers renting out a billboard to advocate for stricter limits on speckled trout. It's an example of the conservation ethic within this community that we all understand. That you'll recall back when we were all advocating for the Modern Fish Act. I was always surprised at how many folks thought that, oh, this is just the recreational fishing community trying to steal more fish for themselves and kill more fish, when it's it's the exact opposite. This is a community that strongly advocates for conservation and the resource, and will be the first ones to stand up when there's a challenge, like we're seeing in species like striped bass right now that need some help. But I guess just taking a step back. So when I first moved to Fredericksburg almost 14 years ago, started working at ASA, and I looked up who my congressman was, which was you, and I saw that you went to Virginia Tech, which is my alma mater, who, by the way, picked up a nice win tonight over Virginia. So I saw that you loved to fish, and I thought, oh, this should work out great. And sure enough, yeah, Jesse said there in the introduction, you've been a huge champion for our industry. But as you said already, this isn't blending just your personal passion, but you also represent a district in which fishing and the Chesapeake Bay and these resources are so important. So can you talk a little bit more about that? So what drives you to get so involved in these issues?
Sure. Well, I've been, very passionate about fisheries my entire life. When I grew up, my dad was an outdoorsman, and some of the best memories I have of my dad and myself were out fishing. And of course, he liked fishing both freshwater and in the saltwater. So we would go to places like Chickahominy Lake in New Kent County, down to the Chesapeake Bay. We had a little aluminum Starcraft boat, and we'd go out and fish in the bay all the time. So I just developed a real passion for the outdoors. And as you said, went to Virginia Tech. My major was biology. My minor was fisheries science. So I loved that particular aspect of the science part of it. Got very, very interested with that. Had a chance as an undergraduate to do a lot of field work for National Marine Fisheries Service and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So I became very interested in the connection between the science and the public policy. It's one thing to, as you said, to advocate for the resource itself, to enjoy the resource, but it's another thing too to look at how are these decisions made and what all goes into the decisions, and how do we come up with the data? How do we make sure that we validate the data? And the thing that always would get me is that there was so much observational data that would come at us. We'd be out. Great example. We were out in the Cowpasture River. We were tagging stocked rainbow trout, and we were trying to determine the catchability of those trout. Were they easier to catch? Did they fight better? Because the argument about hatchery trout is that they're so dumb. You catch them on anything, and then you just deplete the resource. But it was interesting to me how, in that particular situation, the research that we were doing was based on observational data and judgment from fishermen. And I always thought, why are we doing more of that sort of research? Why are we looking at truly, the observational data that comes from fishermen? So I began my interest there, worked professionally in the seafood safety program in Virginia, ran that for a number of years. So I got to see, much of what happened in the fishery, a lot of it from the commercial side, but some of it from the recreational side. So I developed those interests, and again, my interest graduated from the science part of it to connecting the science and the public policy, which I think many times, doesn't happen the way that we instinctually believe that it should happen.
Yeah, well, it's an interesting and rare perspective that you see in Congress these days of folks who, you see more folks who have the interest in fisheries, but less that, as folks have already heard, that could give you the scientific name of sharks or know how many species are managed by under Magnuson Stevens. So you've got a depth of understanding that is a bit unique and certainly appreciated. But I guess another sort of taking a step back topic for you, we've got this interesting dichotomy in the sport fishing industry right now where, as you know, demand's never been higher. People are fishing at record rates. But at the same time, these supply issues that are affecting so many other industries, parts of the economy, are affecting us too. Cost of everything, especially freight's gone through the roof. So we sometimes end up with empty shelves, angry buyers, which is never good. But, again, in perspective, people continue to fish like never before. So as you're working on these economic issues as a whole and what's going on in Congress, I guess what's your view on the economy as a whole? What do you think needs to get done, and what can be done through Congress to at least try to address all these disruptions and inflation, everything that's ongoing?
Sure. Well, Mike, I think the biggest thing people are dealing with today is twofold. It's inflation, so increased costs. When you have inflation, the first thing that gets affected is disposable income. So disposable income, or for things like recreation or going out to eat, if you're going to buy that fishing reel or fishing rod, or if you're going to go on a fishing trip, all of a sudden that's something that, if you're really pressed in your family budget, you're not going to be able to do that. So that's an issue. Supply chain is another issue, being able to, as you said, put things on the shelf that customers want. And there's a lot of that going on. I'll give you a great example. I was trying to buy a particular brand of fishing reel, and I just couldn't find it. The company that was manufacturing those, you couldn't find it here, and sometimes I could find it with different overseas vendors, couldn't find it there. It was just a matter of the current inventory was completely sold out, and there wasn't any inventory in the windshield for the future. So, having experienced that, I know that issues in the supply chain are incredibly important. The question then becomes, how do we address inflation? Well, listen, a lot of inflation is driven by the number of dollars that are out there that the federal government has put out for COVID. And listen, some of those things we needed to do, I would argue the depth of spending that was put forth was not needed. Some of it was to help businesses bridge that gap through the shutdown, but the additional dollars there were for many things unrelated to that. That being said, the money is out there, so you have too many dollars chasing too few goods, and anybody that knows anything about the economy knows that's a recipe for inflation. And then when you exacerbate that, so you have all these dollars floating around out there chasing goods, and then when you have a shortage of goods because of the supply chain, all of a sudden the inflation engine gets driven even more. Now, listen, I think there's some things that we can do to address supply chain issues. To me, it's an issue of logistics. You have too much coming in to too few places. If you look at the total port capacity, Mike, throughout the United States, we have more than enough capacity to bring those containers in from around the world. The problem is many of them are staged and transported to a handful of ports, most of them on the West Coast. And when you have those ships anchored up, many times, scores of ships anchored up waiting to offload their containers, and then because you can't get the containers out fast enough because you're lacking chassis to put the containers on for an 18-wheeler to haul them away, and you're placing them in fields and you're waiting months on end just to find a chassis to put that trailer on, or you're waiting months on end to find a ship that's coming over with your container. And then when a cost of a container shipment now goes from $4,000 to $5,000 to $20,000 to $25,000, that's really tough. And if you got a container with 10,000 pairs of tennis shoes in it, that's one thing. If you got a container in it that have 6 large water pumps and that's all it can carry, it's a hard time defraying that additional cost over those 6 items. So, what we have to look at is, how do we logistically change things? And I've talked to our carriers, that is our ocean carriers, companies that are in the business of putting containers on ships and moving them around. How do we get them to put together what I would call a dashboard that's available to truckers as we speak today. So if you're hauling a load out to the West Coast and you're saying, you know what, I sure would like to have a backhaul. I'd like to have a load to bring back because I've got to travel back anyway, and I'd like to be able to make some money on that. There's actually a dashboard that you can go to and say, okay, who has a load that's looking to come back to Virginia? And maybe if you got a load to drop off in Los Angeles, California, maybe you can't find a load in Los Angeles to bring all the way back, but maybe you find one in Tulsa, Oklahoma, or maybe you find one in Cincinnati, Ohio, still on a way back, and then you can make some money to do that. Nothing's like that in the container industry. What you need to have is a dashboard where somebody here can say, I need a container of these particular things. And whether it's a distributor that says, I need a container of fishing reels to get to all my customers, but it looks like the soonest I can get that container is 3 months from now. And that's with it going to Long Beach and then Long Beach on a container to here. Instead of looking at the dashboard and going, okay, you know, now that we've got the ability on the East Coast to be able to bring these loads in here, you know, even though it may take an additional 7 days, 14 days to bring a ship through the Panama Canal, it's still a lot shorter to bring that ship to one of the East Coast ports, offload that container, than it is to have it wait on a ship on the West Coast and have it wait in a port on the West Coast to find a truck to be able to bring it to me. So we've got to do a better job logistically about looking at capacity. What I'm concerned about is there's going to be a lot of excess capacity that's built, that is more shipping containers, more ships. And then when demand settles out, all of a sudden the imbalance is still there. So I think there are ways that we can do it. We just have to be smarter. I think the industry needs to, by itself, it shouldn't be a government sponsored effort. I think the industry needs to create a dashboard. If you're one of the ocean carriers, you need to establish a dashboard that says, you can go to Matson's dashboard and say, okay, what ships are coming where? I need to get a container from Japan to the United States. What's my best option? And those are things that I think can help, at least on supply chain shortages. And then last but not least, and I would argue the most important thing, is that, you know, we need to get back to making things in the United States. I know my wife looks all the time. She'll tell you when she goes to the store, she looks for the Made in USA label. And if she can't find it, many times she comes home with an empty cart because she's so adamant about being dependent upon China in the supply chain. Now, listen, there are some fishing tackle elements from different countries, Japan being one of them, that are incredible, and you can't get those here. But I would argue that there are companies out there like St. Croix Rods and others that make an extraordinary product, a product that's as good as any product anywhere on the face of the earth. So we ought to make sure that we are supporting our USA manufacturers, and whenever we can, whenever it's available, you know, we ought to be buying USA made products. And listen, there's no shortage of those in the United States, especially in the major tackle lines. I mean, if you're looking for a fishing rod or a fishing reel, or even for that matter, in lures, there are a tremendous number of US manufacturers. So we can do our part by buying USA, and that helps too on the inflation and demand side.
Yeah. Well, I know everyone appreciates the thoughts and work you put in on addressing some of these supply issues, which is, as you said, is maybe partially a government role, but a lot of that's going to be, you know, private sector innovation to help work through that. But I've got a few other questions, but if folks have any questions they want to ask, there should be somewhere on these tabs a drop-down menu for either questions or chat. So feel free to type those in, and we'll cover them. But I get, Congressman, looking ahead to the second half of this Congress, although we're a little bit ways into the second half, you know, there's still the issue of government funding, which I know you have very strong opinions on Congress's role and past issues of, you know, continuing to kick the can down the road and leaving for home in August when the government hasn't been funded yet. But we still got what's going to maybe happen with Build Back Better or components of it. You know, with the natural resource, there's things like Recovering America's Wildlife Act, as you mentioned, Magnuson-Stevens Act. I guess what's your sort of crystal ball? What do you think gets done, kind of big picture standpoint, over the remainder of the year? And is there room for some of these natural resource priorities to get through too?
Well, listen, I think there's a great path forward for Recovering America's Wildlife Act. I was one of the original co-sponsors. There's some folks on our side of the aisle that had some issues with it. What I have done is to talk to members of our caucus and have encouraged them to engage folks in the different interest groups beforehand. So as these ideas are being crafted, instead of waiting, for the bill to come to committee and saying, "Oh, I don't like this or don't like that about it," we have to be out front and say, what can we do to get to a yes? What can we do to be in favor of many of the aspects of this bill that are incredibly important for our nation's natural resources, especially for our wildlife and fisheries resources. So, we have to be more proactive in working within those realms. But I do think that bill passes. I do think there'll be some version of Magnuson-Stevens authorization that'll at least pass the House. I don't know exactly what will happen over on the Senate side. As far as funding goes, there's a lot of back and forth. We did another continuing resolution, which is, again, kicking the can down the road for another 30 days. That doesn't solve the problem. We need an appropriations bill. And the difficulty is, everybody says, oh, they call them the big four, which are the chairman and ranking member of House Appropriations, chairman and ranking member of Senate Appropriations. You hear all this and saying, oh, the big four has reached an agreement. And I tell folks with a high degree of skepticism that's great. 4 people out of 535 have reached agreement. That doesn't assure us anything. So the question is can they come up with some sort of agreement in principle? And then can that agreement get 218 votes in the House? And can it get either 51 votes in the Senate or 60, depending on where it originates in the process that it goes through? So those are things that I think are incredibly important for us to remember. I mean, listen, I'm a realist. We need an appropriations bill. It will be some form of an omnibus appropriations bills, and I don't like them because they lump everything in there. It becomes a Christmas tree, so you throw a bunch of stuff in hopes of getting it passed. But I think that there will be some form of an appropriations bill that'll come before us in March, hopefully to pass. Mike, I think if we don't get an appropriations bill done in March, it would be, I think, incredibly unfortunate and incredibly harmful to the nation if we did a continuing resolution for the year. But I think if you don't get an appropriations bill done by this next deadline in March, I think really you're looking at a year-long continuing resolution, which is incredibly harmful. I hope that's not the case. I hope that they come up with an omnibus bill. But it's, as the old song goes, there's a long ways to go and a short time to get there. So.
Well, we've had good questions come in, but last one from me for now. As you well know, we had a high-profile gubernatorial race in Virginia last fall with, folks aren't aware, Republican businessman Glenn Youngkin, who had no previous political experience, winning. And in doing so, he walked this remarkable fine line, even within your district, of being able to appeal to both Northern Virginia suburban moms, as well as your, Westmoreland County Trump supporters. Do you think this was a unique situation to Virginia, or is there something with Governor Youngkin's path to victory that may have broader national lessons to be learned?
Listen, I think there are a lot of broader national lessons that can be learned with Glenn's campaign. I've had a chance to work with him. In fact, I was just on the phone with him yesterday. And, he is an incredibly thoughtful individual. He's very personable. I think running for elective office is not only about having a grasp of the policy issues, but it's how you communicate them. It's how do you connect with people. Glenn did a great job of connecting with people on the right issues. He was able to capture a concern and passion on issues involving education that don't typically happen with Republican candidates. So that was something that everybody is looking at. And he was able to capture too a level of frustration that exists within folks' hearts about what's happening with government. And it's not just here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, it's in states and commonwealths across the nation, as well as our nation as a whole. So I think there's a lot to be learned from Glenn's campaign. I am working feverishly to get him out on the water to enjoy the great fisheries that we have in Virginia this coming year. So be on the lookout for that, Mike. I'll make sure that I keep you plugged in, and we'll let you know when that's going to occur, because I think it's a great opportunity to make sure that he's aware of natural resources. Listen, on the other side too, as you know, he's having an incredibly difficult time getting his Secretary of Natural Resources confirmed. There's still a chance that his nominee could be confirmed, although the window continues to close on that. And if not, he'll have to come back with another nominee, and they'll probably have to confirm that person, if they so choose to, during the veto session, which doesn't occur until April. So if they don't get it done by essentially the end of the first week in March, which is the end of the General Assembly in Virginia, we have short-term and shorter-term general assemblies. This is a year where it goes into March, so it's a 90-day term, and so you get whatever you're going to get done in 90 days, and all the bills have to be done. Budget has to be adopted by then, and most of the time they get it done on time. Sometimes they have to go a day or two over, but I would say that's where we are with Glenn, and hopefully some of the things where we can connect him on the natural resource side, and then we'll see what happens with his nominee for Secretary of Natural Resources.
Well, appreciate that and your attempts to get him on the water. That was one of the things we were struggling to find out, was what is his past experience with fishing. But I'm confident you'll get him fully up to speed in short order.
I've gone skeet shooting with him before, so I know he knows his way around that element of outdoor sports. So to me, it's a natural connection to put a fishing rod in his hand and get him out in the water. So. Yeah.
Usually, if you can do one, you can do the other. So, so let's move on to some of the questions we've got come in. The first one's from a gentleman you may know, Dave Pfeiffer, president of Shimano.
Yes.
One of those photos and show things you Shimano had on. So he's wondering a little further south of you with South Atlantic red snapper, what can be done, not just with that fishery, but this is kind of more broadly. You know, you talked about data. And in the South Atlantic, we're waiting several more years until we get an updated stock assessment. In the meantime, we keep humming along with just a 2 or 3 day season, which I think everyone agrees is pretty ridiculous and woefully too short. So do you have any thoughts, whether this plays into Magnuson-Stevens or otherwise? How do we incorporate data quicker? How do we get more quality data to help shorten some of these time lags we see in stock assessments and actually seeing results on the water?
Mike, that's a great question. Listen, I think the whole system of stock assessments, gathering data, analyzing it, and getting it to a form that you can use to make fisheries management decisions is antiquated. It's antiquated, and it's full of bureaucratic inertia. What we have to do, I believe, is come up with a different way to be able to manage fisheries, especially fisheries that are recreationally important and recreationally popular. As I said, you know, with 560 plus species, there's no way that you have enough resources to do stock assessments and all of those. And you can look at those species that are under duress, you know, that are challenged, that are endangered, however you want to term it. But you know, I would like to see us change the paradigm about how fisheries management is done. And listen, we all know, you know, what happens in stock assessments, looking at biomass in different age classes, looking at total fecundity, determining, you know, how, and that's what happens with not only, it's not spawning success, but it's how many eggs are out there, how many out there are potentially there to hatch, and that is what's the reproductive capacity of the fish population, and then look at mortality. And do that quickly, and then be willing to look at different ways to gather data. I would argue National Marine Fisheries Service is too stovepiped in how they are willing to collect data. They are not, and we try to get it through in legislation. We've got it through, and NIMS has been still very resistant to do anything other than their very regimented effort to gather data on fisheries. We have to be able to break through that and put out a different paradigm. And if you look at what's happened, I think that there are some examples out there. Garrett Graves and I have a lot of conversations together about what needs to happen on the fisheries management side. And as you know, the Gulf and South Atlantic states were successful on the red snapper fishery to say, hey, NIMS, you're just not doing the job. So we were able to get through in legislation something that said, we'll actually hire a different firm to do the stock assessment, because NIMS kept saying, oh, we don't have the time, we don't have the money, same excuses with government. So when that stock assessment was done, lo and behold, guess what? There are a lot more red snapper out there. Now, I would argue National Marine Fisheries Service then took their own statutory roundabout to still reduce the fishery, catch below what the stock assessment said it could do under a maximum sustainable yield model, but it still got recreational fishermen more fish. So what I think we need to do, Mike, and I would love to work with ASA with that, and as well as all your members, is we ought to be thinking about how do we look at a change to how we do stock assessments, and how do we change how we prioritize where data is collected, and how do we make sure too that the funding mechanism is specific to a line item that funds stock assessments each year, so that fishermen know the stock assessment for this year is going to be funded, and it's done statutorily rather than a line item that puts a bunch of money in National Marine Fisheries Service, and then they determine what pot it goes into, and they determine how, when, and where the stock assessments are done. So I would argue you have to break the current paradigm for stock assessments within National Marine Fisheries Service and do things differently. And Dave brings up a great point, and that is the current model is broken. It's not timely. It doesn't, I think, take the full scope of data that needs to be taken into consideration in making proper management decisions. And if you don't have the trust and faith of the recreational fishing community in how you're making those decisions, then I argue then your decision making is flawed. And it's great to have, the technical advisory committees, to have civilians in there, but many times, they through courtesy say, yeah, we hear you, we hear all your stuff, but we're still going to make the decision in the way that we see fit. So I think there's a great opportunity for us to be able to do that, and I would look forward to working with ASA to accomplish that.
Great. Well, I know we've got a few minutes left. I'll try to blend a couple of questions here together. First comes from Mike Jackson with Eagle Claw, who's wondering what it was like working on a fishing boat in college, and how you compare the Chesapeake Bay fishery today versus 30 plus years ago. And I guess if you could blend within that, we've had several folks ask about striped bass and the current state of the striped bass fishery. So if you could sort of share sort of your historical perspective on when you first really became familiarized with the bay and its fisheries to where we stand now. What changes have you seen over that time?
Absolutely. Well, listen, I've seen a giant change in the striped bass fishery. I remember when I was a child being down on the Outer Banks and seine netters coming in and seine netting these massive schools of striped bass as they would come down the coast, and they came from all over. I'll never forget that, seeing them haul all those fish up on the beach, and I thought, wow, those are some big fish, but that's a lot of fish to be hauling up on the beach. And then when I worked as both a high schooler and as a college student on charter boats, I worked both in the Carolinas and in Virginia. I remember in the Chesapeake Bay was full of, in the springtime to the fall, giant bluefish. And listen, we made a living off of taking charters out and chumming to catch bluefish, and these fish were anywhere from 8 pounds to 20 pounds. An incredible fishery. We also had an incredible gray sea trout or weak fish fishery. I have one on my wall. The biggest one I ever caught was 35 inches. It was just short of 15 pounds. Just incredible fishery. And of course, as you know, those fish are not around anymore as they used to be. Now, we've caught some nice ones offshore, but not that type of fishery in the bay. So the bay fishery has changed quite a bit. And the same too with striped bass. Even as little as a dozen years ago, the striped bass fishery in the bay was incredible. And it was nothing to go out there. If you fished really hard, you could catch a trophy-sized fish, especially in the winter time of the year. Those fish are far and few between now. I think one of the big things we have to look at again is, try to determine the entire management spectrum with a highly migratory anadromous species that ranges from Long Island and coastal New England down to the Chesapeake Bay, and then look at how we manage that fishery overall, and then do a better job too of the stock assessment. There's a long time management scheme that begins with what's called the young of the year stock assessment. So they go to certain areas on the bay, as you know, they take a seine net and they go out and they seine net there, and they figure out how many young striped bass are in that seine net sample. The difficulty is that if you go to the same place every year, it's kind of like the red snapper paradigm. You keep going to the same place, and the question is don't the fish habits change? Don't fish migration patterns change? Don't the areas where these young of the year striped bass show up? So some of that has changed, but not in ways that I think is necessary to really have a full scope of what's happening with the striped bass. I think we have to look too about management regimes. I mean, people love fishing for striped bass. I love fishing for the trophy size striped bass, but I understand too that you shouldn't be able to fish for them during the spawning season. And remember, up until just a few years ago, you could fish for those fish in places like the Potomac River at the peak of the spawning season, which is supposed to be a trophy season, but why would you want to target a striped bass on a spawning run? It just doesn't make sense. So we have to look at things like that. Another thing too, it goes back to another fishery science term. It goes back to fecundity. The most prolific spawning fish are those fish that are older. Older than what a 24-inch or 26-inch size limit would protect. So the question is are there more things that we can do to protect our big spawners? And I know everybody would like to catch a big trophy striped bass, but I would argue the best eating ones are the smaller ones, and the best place for a 50-inch. We also know too that if you target those fish during the warm water months of the year, the survivability on striped bass that have been caught in warm water months is not good. So to me, we ought to relook at the management paradigm, and that is what are we doing? And Virginia's done some of this, but there's a disparity in what different states are doing. And of course, ASMFC addresses a lot of that, but I think you have to look at the management paradigm and look at what are we doing to protect those really prolific spawners, and in some way, shape, or form, severely limit the number of fish that are harvested in that size class. The smaller size class, I think the spawning biomass there can withstand, a fairly vigorous fishery. The large spawners cannot. So I want to make sure that we get our large spawners, because they are genetically the best in the gene pool. They are the most prolific. So those are the ones that we ought to be protecting, and give some provision in there, to maybe you issue somebody a tag to take one trophy fish a year, and then release the rest, and then limit to any sort of targeting of those fish during the time of year when we know the mortality rate's not going to be off the charts. So I think those are things that are critical to ensure that we have that spawning biomass that we need. I think that's the biggest element. And when I look at the data, and again, not a professional fisheries manager, but looking at the data, to me, it really is all about the spawning biomass, fecundity, and how are we going to get good spawns, even if you have a bad year, even if you have environmental conditions that don't allow good recruitment. You can survive a bad recruitment year, a high mortality year, if you have good fecundity across all the age classes. So I think that's where the management paradigm needs to go.
Well, Congressman, we'd love to talk to you more about striped bass. We've had questions about 30 by 30 and tariffs and all sorts of other stuff that unfortunately we're not going to be able to get to here today, because I know you've got to run. But really appreciate your time and insights here, and I know everyone's coming away with a much deeper appreciation for at least one champion in Congress who lives and breathes this stuff and puts his passion towards it. So look forward to continue working with you on all these challenges going forward, and hopefully getting some good policy done. So we'll turn to you for any parting thoughts.
Sounds great, Mike. Well, listen, I want to make sure I get to those questions, even though we can't get to them on this call. So if you make sure you capture those questions, get them over to us. I'll make sure that the folks on the call get answers to their questions. I know these things are incredibly important. Another thing too, Mike, is I would encourage your members to give us their thoughts and ideas. I mean, the solutions to the things that we face within the recreational fisheries and within fisheries management don't rest inside the Beltway. That's why I think it's incredibly important for ASA to really have an extensive conversation about what is it that should be changed in the management paradigm and the data collection paradigm as to modernizing how we manage fisheries, and how do we get the most current information in the most accurate way possible that reflects the entire scope of information that's out there, not just in a fairly narrow structure that NIMS puts forward. So I'd love to work with you all on that, and just encourage your members to reach out to us. Let us know your thoughts and ideas. As I said, the solutions to the challenges we face do not rest inside that 60 square miles of fantasy land we call Washington. They're out there with what you all are dealing with each and every day. So I appreciate all the great work that ASA does. I want to encourage you to, stay in touch, not only with myself, but with your other members. And we want to make sure we're doing the right things for our recreational fisheries.
Absolutely. Well, maybe we'll work on that Modern Fish Act 2.0 here shortly.
Yes.
We can start addressing.
Absolutely.
All right.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for your time and insights, and look forward to staying in touch, and stay well and take care.
Sounds great. Thanks, Mike. Thanks again. Thanks to all your members. Thanks.
All right. Thanks everybody
Thank
for joining.
Thanks so much.